By the most conservative estimates, 3,000 people died outside of combat. They died on operating tables and in the test chambers of Unit 731. A scalpel cuts into living flesh. The person is fully conscious, their screams ignored. This is not the work of medieval savages. This is the work of 20th century medical scientists, graduates of prestigious universities. Their monstrous logic was cold and simple. Anesthesia, in their view, could distort the research results. This was not random sadism. It was a calculated system where the scientific objective completely supplanted humanity and the Hippocratic Oath. This gives rise to the central question of this investigation. How did people whose profession is to save lives transform into the most sophisticated executioners? This was not medieval barbarism, but a 20th century scientific project, and this is only the tip of the iceberg. 3 paradoxes shatter Japan's official history. First, General Shiro Ishii, the architect of thousands of deaths. There are volumes of documented evidence of his crimes. So why did he not only escape punishment, but also receive full immunity from a superpower? Second, the Edo period, a time of exquisite art and delicate poetry, and simultaneously, the time of the state law, Kujikata Osadamagaki, an official manual for the application of torture. Why did the state feel the need not to ban pain, but to systematize and legalize it? And the third most profound paradox brings us back to the operating room. What compelled the top graduates of medical universities, the nation's elite, to voluntarily become part of a death machine, surpassing medieval warriors in their cruelty? These are 3 key questions that official history fails to answer. To understand this horror, we must dissect its internal logic. This is not a collection of random atrocities, but a frighteningly coherent system. At its core lies an invisible link between 3 phenomena. First, the Bushido Code of Honor, which created the psychological foundation for absolute obedience. Second, state laws that turned pain into a legal instrument of power. And third, 20th century militarism, which used this foundation to create scientific terror. This process is like the growth of a poisonous plant. Its seed, the ancient samurai code of honor, the soil in which it grew, state laws that legalized pain, and the toxic fruit it bore, the cold scientific terror of Unit 731. Today, these events may seem like disparate nightmares, but they are connected by a single, deadly logic. This investigation will proceed through 3 key points of revelation. The first point awaits in 6 minutes: the declassified archives of the shogunate and the most gruesome instruments from the official state torture code of the Edo period. The second point, in 14 minutes, a reconstruction of what truly happened in the secret laboratories of Unit 731 to the people cynically referred to as logs. The third and final point, in 16 minutes, the details of the secret deal between the U.S. and Shiro Ishii, a deal that allowed the 20th century's worst criminals to escape justice and profitably sell their crimes. These are 3 markers on the timeline of this horror. The first is approaching. In 6 minutes, the Japanese state will legalize pain, turning it into a theater of intimidation. To understand how a state legalizes pain, one must first understand how it creates a person willing to inflict it. The Bushido Code, glorified in legends, was in practice a tool of submission. Its 7 virtues: justice, courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and loyalty. But these principles were not equal. Loyalty to one's master, Chugi, acted like gravity. It pulled all other virtues toward it, distorting their meaning. If an order demanded cruelty, carrying it out became the highest expression of honor. This gave rise to the right of Kirisut Gomen, a samurai could kill a commoner with impunity for a mere insult. He was both judge and executioner. Loyalty superseded morality. This logic devalued the lives of others, and in turn, it devalued one's own life as well. The ritual suicide of seppuku seems like an act of supreme personal honor. But whose honor was it really protecting? The failure of one samurai cast a shadow over his entire clan. Therefore, seppuku was less a personal choice than a social necessity. It was a way to amputate the problem to save the system's reputation. The same logic demanded absolute cruelty toward the clan's enemies, including their women and children. Their annihilation was also a matter of honor. The value of any life, even one's own, was determined by its usefulness to the system. Often, an assistant, the kaishakunin, would end the suffering with a single sword stroke, turning an act of personal will into a precisely orchestrated ritual. Have you ever had to place the interests of a group above your own principles? But how could a warrior who practiced meditation commit such atrocities? The answer lies in the concept of mushin, or no mind. At first glance, it is a spiritual practice for achieving calmness and concentration in battle. But in reality, this state allowed for the complete shutdown of personal emotions and empathy. The samurai became not an individual, but a perfect instrument, an empty vessel filled by the will of his master. This is not the serenity of a humanist, but the cold-bloodedness of an executioner. This state is like holding your breath. You consciously suppress a natural reflex, empathy, to carry out an unnatural order. The psychology of the ideal subordinate has been created. But what happens when this psychology becomes the foundation of state law? All of this created the ideal personality type for an authoritarian system. 3 pillars. Bushido provided the ideological justification, loyalty. Seppuku demonstrated the price of disobedience. The clan's honor is worth more than a life. Mushin supplied the psychological tool, the shutdown of empathy. Thus, a person was forged who did not ask why, but how. Personal responsibility is replaced by responsibility to a superior. What happens when such a philosophy becomes the basis not just for a warrior class, but for the entire judicial system of a state? Violence ceases to be an anomaly. It becomes a regulated procedure. We have dissected the psychology of the warriors. Now let's see how bureaucrats used this psychology to build a theater of pain. The Edo period, a time of refined poetry and blooming gardens, and a time when the state decided not to ban torture, but to legalize it. In 1742, the Kujikata Osada Damagaki Code appeared. At first glance, this was progress. The law was introduced to limit the arbitrary power of judges, permitting torture only under strict protocol and with substantial evidence. But this was an illusion of humanism. In reality, legalization turned ibausini into an assembly line. In a system where an acquittal was a disgrace for a judge, a confession became the ultimate proof. The law did not seek the truth. It manufactured it. It was needed to create a theater of total intimidation. And in this theater, there were reserved seats. Samurai and aristocrats were not subjected to torture. Thus, the state demonstrated whose pain mattered. And for ideological enemies, a special performance was prepared. This is the torture of tsurushi. A person was hung upside down over a pit of filth. An incision was made on their temple to allow blood to drip slowly, preventing a quick loss of consciousness. Why such complex and inefficient cruelty for an interrogation? Physiology was merely a tool. The rush of blood to the head and days of agony prolonged the torment, which could last up to 9 days. But the real purpose was symbolic. This torture was widely used on Japanese Christians. The pit of waste symbolized hell. The slow death provided time for reflection and renunciation of their faith. This was not torture, but a public ideological re-education. The victim's body became a battlefield for their soul. But if tsurushi was for ideological enemies, what instrument was used to obtain routine confessions? The answer: ishidaki, or stone torture. What was its secret? The procedure seemed simple. A person was forced to kneel on ridged wooden beams, and heavy stone slabs were placed on their thighs. But the devil was in the details. The weight of the slabs was gradually increased, reaching up to 400 kilograms, 80 pounds. It was as if 4 adult men were standing on the person's legs. The pain escalated slowly, predictably, shattering the knee joints and turning the interrogation into a methodical procedure. This is a perfect example of the bureaucratization of violence. The process was completely controllable. The executioner could dose out the pain, extracting the desired testimony with almost surgical precision. A confession obtained this way nullified the need for other evidence, devaluing the very search for truth. The system and the psychology of the perpetrator are already in place. Only one element is missing: the ideology of scientific supremacy. What we are seeing is not chaotic barbarism. It is a cold, calculated, and legalized system of state control. It had a legal basis: the Kujikata Osadamagaki Code. It had specialized tools: tsurushi for ideological warfare, ishidaki for routine interrogations, and it had psychologically prepared perpetrators. Over centuries, the Japanese state had honed the skill of systemic, dehumanized violence. The human body ceased to be sacred. It became an object, an instrument, like a hammer or a chisel for building state order. What would happen if this refined system were combined with imperial ambitions and 20th century technology? The answer is simple. The sword would be replaced by the syringe, and the torture chamber would become a scientific laboratory. But how did the cruelty of the warrior mutate into the cold-bloodedness of the scientist? In the early 20th century, Japan invaded Manchuria. It looked like a typical colonial war, but its true engine was racial ideology. Propaganda turned the Chinese, Russians, and Koreans into subhuman beings. In official reports, they were called maruta, or logs. This was a philosophical dehumanization. The ancient Bushido code demanded respect for a worthy enemy. But if the opponent is not a person but a log, no codes apply. This ideology created the opportunity. It needed an architect. His name was Shiro Ishii, an ambitious military doctor. After a 2-year tour of 30 countries in Europe and America, he returned with a single idea: biological warfare. Ishii realized that for resource-poor Japan, this was the perfect weapon: cheap, invisible, and capable of crushing an enemy without a single shot. This was not sadism, but cold, patriotic calculation. His main argument to the top military brass was devastatingly simple. Animals react to bacteria differently than humans. To create an effective weapon, human test subjects are necessary, and the war in China provided unlimited access to them. But how to convince generals raised on a code of honor of the necessity of such a project? At first, Ishii's idea was met with skepticism. Biological weapons were considered unworthy of a warrior. But Ishii proved to be a brilliant lobbyist. The young doctor in a perfectly pressed uniform stood before gray-haired generals. He showed not photos of horrors, but charts of economic efficiency. He spoke not of cruelty, but of national security, of victory over the USSR with minimal losses. He even promised that the data would help create vaccines for the Japanese army. In 1936, his pragmatism won. The project received funding. Thus, a perfect storm formed. 3 deadly components came together. First, the psychology of the ideal subordinate, forged by Bushido. Second, the experience of legalized state violence from the Edo period. And third, a new ideology that turned the enemy into raw material. Shiro Ishii was the catalyst. He took ancient cruelty, dressed it in a white lab coat, and gave it a scientific purpose. He created not just a squad of killers, but a complex bureaucratic structure, a scientific institute of death. We have seen how this idea was born. Now it is time to dissect its anatomy. To the outside world, it was the main office for water supply and prophylaxis of the Kwantung Army units. A routine sanitation service. Its task, clean water for soldiers and epidemic control. But the numbers destroy this bureaucratic idol. It was a secret city covering 6 square kilometers, larger than the Principality of Monaco. 150 buildings, a staff of 3,600 people, including hundreds of Japan's best scientists and doctors. 8 divisions, its own aviation unit. Factories for producing billions of microbes. The people who came here were not the dregs of society. They were graduates of prestigious universities in Tokyo and Kyoto. They were lured by unlimited resources and a patriotic mission. But the true anatomy of the horror was hidden in the specialization of these divisions. On paper, it looked like a serious research center. The 1st Division studied plague, cholera, and anthrax. The 4th Division produced these bacteria on an industrial scale. The 5th trained personnel. But the goal was not treatment. The goal was a weapon. The 2nd Division developed methods for its delivery, ceramic bombs filled with infected fleas and systems for spraying bacteria. The 3rd Division produced the casings for these bombs. This was not a scientific institute, but a deadly food processor. Some divisions selected the ingredients. Others grew them. A 3rd made the containers. A 4th served the dish. It was a complete production cycle, and it required a constant supply of raw material. Who were these people? For the rank-and-file staff, the answer was simple. Spies, saboteurs, particularly dangerous criminals. Enemies of the empire, sentenced to death. The reality was different. According to various estimates, between 3,000 and 10,000 people died here. 70% of them were Chinese, civilians, women, and children. Another 300 were Russians, as well as Koreans and Mongolians. They were supplied by the Kempeitai military police, often without trial. Inside the complex, they lost their names and became numbers. No one ever left its walls alive. When one experiment ended, the log was passed on to the next laboratory, and so on until death. Then the bodies were burned in a crematorium. But the most horrifying part is what was done to them. None of this was chaos, but cold calculation. A perfect bureaucratic machine where the division of labor removed personal responsibility. One person caught, another transported, a 3rd conducted the experiment, a 4th burned the corpse. The person breeding fleas considered himself an entomologist. The doctor performing the autopsy, a pathologist. The system allowed them to not feel like murderers. Many of them lived ordinary lives after the war, became professors, respected doctors, and never repented. We have seen the flawless structure of this machine. Now, prepare to see its bloody work. What you are about to hear is difficult to accept, but it is necessary to understand the full scale of the crime. Vivisection of a living person without anesthesia. This was not an anomaly, but a standard procedure. In the logic of Unit 731, painkillers distorted data on pain shock and the rate of blood loss. The person was not a patient, but a biological mannequin. Their suffering was a variable that had to be eliminated for the purity of the experiment. This monstrous practice was not an isolated incident. It was an assembly line through which thousands passed. 70% of them were Chinese. Often, the purpose of vivisection was to remove infected organs from still living people for further study. The human body became merely a container for the material they needed. But vivisection was not the only method where human suffering became a tool of science, turning even natural phenomena into weapons of torture. Frostbite research. At first glance, the goal was pragmatic: to find a treatment for soldiers fighting in Manchuria. Victims were taken out into the freezing cold. Their limbs were doused with water until completely frozen. Researchers would tap the frozen arms with a stick. A sound like tapping on wood meant the experiment could proceed, but the real horror began at the treatment stage. Instead of searching for humane ways to rewarm them, scientists would plunge the limbs into boiling water or hold them over an open fire, observing the development of gangrene. A witness at the Khabarovsk trials would later describe how, after immersing a frostbitten limb in boiling water, the blackened skin and muscles would slide off the bones like a single stocking. While some were tortured with cold, others were used as living targets for testing new, even more lethal weapons. Why use people if you have mannequins? The answer is simple. A mannequin cannot show how a bacteriological weapon or fine shrapnel affects living tissue. On a special testing ground, people were tied to posts in concentric circles, at distances of 10, 20, and 50 meters from the epicenter of the explosion. But the most terrible part happened afterward. The survivors received no medical aid. They were immediately taken to laboratories for dissection, often while still alive, to study the fresh damage to their internal organs. The person was not the subject, but a measuring device. Their body served as a living grid for recording the blast radius. We have seen the scale of the crimes, but the most important question remains unanswered. Where was justice? 3 pillars of scientific cruelty: vivisections for data, frostbite experiments to study pain, and the use of humans as targets for weapons. Thousands of perpetrators. Hundreds of thousands of pages of reports. Tens of thousands of victims. With such a body of evidence, justice seems inevitable. How could such a vast death machine disappear without a trace, and its creators evade responsibility? The story of the cover-up of these crimes is no less shocking than the experiments themselves. Justice was not just denied, it was sold. Not one of the more than 3,600 employees of Unit 731 was prosecuted in Japan. After the surrender, Shiro Ishii faked his own funeral and ordered his subordinates to take their secrets to the grave. Key buildings were blown up, documents burned. It seemed they had almost managed to disappear, but American intelligence, specialists from Fort Detrick, quickly found Ishii. What awaited him was not a tribunal, but a proposal. The Americans understood. The unit's data from experiments on humans was unique. Against the backdrop of the emerging Cold War with the USSR, it was priceless. Thus, a deal was born, sanctioned by General Douglas MacArthur. Shiro Ishii and his entire team received full immunity in exchange for the exclusive transfer of all results to the American side. This cynical decision had its own ironclad geopolitical logic. Why did the U.S., the organizers of the Nuremberg trials, make a deal with executioners? The official version sounded pragmatic. This data, though obtained at a terrible price, would help protect American soldiers from future biological attacks. But the real reason was panic. The Soviet Union had already begun its own investigation, which led to the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in 1949. The Americans feared that if they didn't get the data first, their main geopolitical rival would. For U.S. intelligence, the data from Unit 731 was like gold in blood-soaked mud. The main thing was not to let this prize fall into Soviet hands. The value of information obtained through torture proved greater than the value of justice for thousands of victims. But what became of the perpetrators who received this devil's amnesty? They did not just escape punishment, they did not become outcasts. Thanks to American immunity, all members of the unit returned to Japan and were considered clean before the law. They did not get lost in the crowd. They took up key positions in Japanese society. Many became deans of medical universities, heads of major hospitals, and founders of pharmaceutical companies. Their experience turned out to be in demand. Major Masaji Kitano, one of the unit's leaders, became the chief director of Japan's largest pharmaceutical corporation, Green Cross, after the war. The crime was not just unpunished. It became profitable. Justice was not served. It was bought. But what consequences did this have for the soul of the nation itself? The criminals were not punished because their crimes turned out to be a commodity that a superpower eagerly bought. What happens to a nation when its most terrible crimes are not condemned, but concealed with the help of a new ally? This deal became the original sin of post-war Japan. It spawned a culture of silence and denial that poisons its historical memory to this day. It was as if a venomous wound was not lanced and cleaned, but simply stitched up, allowing the infection to spread within the body for decades. The criminals gained freedom and prosperity. But what price did the entire Japanese nation pay for this silence? The price of this silence is a policy of national self-deception. Japan's official position today is a complex performance. At the level of individual documents, the existence of Unit 731 is acknowledged, but at the state level, there are no official apologies or compensation for the victims. Two fears lie behind this. The first is legal. A full admission of guilt would open a Pandora's box of multi-billion-dollar lawsuits from China and Korea. The second is domestic. Powerful nationalist forces consider any repentance a betrayal. Therefore, parliamentary hearings are filled with evasive answers, and state museums focus on Japan's own suffering, on Hiroshima, rather than on its aggression. Have you ever encountered a situation in your own country where inconvenient historical facts were distorted by the authorities? This policy creates blank pages in school textbooks. In most of them, Unit 731 is mentioned in a single sentence at best, with no details about the scale of the crimes. This is a stark contrast to Germany, where the history of the Third Reich and the Holocaust is allotted up to 30 hours in the school curriculum. Their repentance has become part of the national identity. The Japanese approach breeds historical amnesia. Generations grow up unaware of the darkest chapters of their country's past. This not only poisons relations with its neighbors, it strips the nation of its immunity against repeating its own mistakes. But while the state and the education system remain silent, there are those within Japan who refuse to forget. These are the modern-day samurai of historical truth, historians and activists who are fighting their own war for memory. Their motivation is not to defame their country, but to heal it through truth. For decades, they have been fighting legal battles, demanding that the government release all documents related to the unit's activities. They search for the last remaining witnesses, organize exhibitions, and give lectures. The cost of this struggle is high. Accusations of being unpatriotic, threats from the far right, ostracism in academic circles. But their work prevents this topic from disappearing. They are preserving the truth for future generations who may be ready to accept it. This silence has poisoned several generations. Now, knowing the full picture, we are ready to bring it all together and provide the final answer. A policy of partial admission, blank pages in textbooks, and the desperate struggle of a few individuals. These are three elements of a single system that maintains historical amnesia. This legacy poisons relations with China and South Korea today. Any contemporary political dispute constantly hits the wall of an unprocessed past. We have traveled the entire path, from the philosophy of the samurai to the experiments of Unit 731 and the post-war cover-up. In the final section, we will bring all the threads together to give a definitive answer to the central question of this investigation: how a culture of honor gave birth to unimaginable cruelty. 3 elements formed a deadly sequence, answering our main question. First, the Bushido Code, where loyalty to a master became superior to any morality. This created the psychology of the ideal subordinate who bears no personal responsibility for cruelty. Second, the laws of the Edo period. Building on this psychology, the state legalized pain without resistance, turning torture into a routine bureaucratic procedure. And the third and final step, 20th century militarism. The old model of loyalty above morality was transferred to a new field, science. Unit 731 was the logical conclusion of this evolution. The goal changed from confession to data. The instrument changed from a stone to a syringe, but the mechanism itself remained the same. This system immediately became enmeshed in bureaucracy. Unit 731 was not a gathering of maniacs. It was an efficient machine with divisions, laboratories, and a clear hierarchy. This structure turned atrocity into an assembly line. Vivisection, frostbite, weapons testing, these were all separate production cycles. Such a system, where a scientist was responsible only for their narrow area of work, allowed for an extreme degree of dehumanization. The victims became logs, raw material. This machine worked like a river carrying poison. Individual scientists were merely drops, but together they created a powerful, destructive current in which all personal responsibility was drowned. And this assembly line produced not only death, it produced a valuable product, data. It was this data that determined the end of the story. The data obtained at the cost of thousands of lives became a commodity. The post-war immunity purchased by the U.S. prevented this system from being condemned and dismantled. The criminal structure was not destroyed, but simply disbanded, preserving its members. The absence of a trial and the external cover-up of the crimes gave rise to an internal culture of silence that prevents Japanese society from overcoming this trauma to this day. Thus, we arrive at the final answer. The cruelty was born not in spite of honor, but through its perversion. Honor as personal virtue was replaced by honor as blind loyalty to a system. The shogun, the emperor, science. It was this substitution that made it possible to justify any atrocity, and post-war cynicism prevented it from being condemned. The 7 elements of our investigation, from the Bushido Code to the legacy of silence, form a single, complete picture. This story leaves us with one last, very uncomfortable question. We have seen 2 forms of evil: the executioner of the Edo period, who tortures according to the law, acting as a cog in the state's machine of intimidation, and the scientist of Unit 731, who violates every conceivable law and oath for the sake of progress. What is more terrifying, evil that operates within the framework of a cruel law, or evil that operates in the name of science, trampling all laws? Write just one word in the comments reflecting your choice: executioner or scientist. Let's discuss.